Hello there, classic TV fans. I'm pop culture historian Dave Sundstrom, and today we're taking a trip back to the wonderful town of Mayfield to reminisce about one of my favorite TV shows, Leave It to Beaver. During the first part of this video, I'm going to talk about Sue Randall, the actress who played Beaver's teacher, Miss Landers. Then we're going to learn more about what happened to Stanley Fafara, the actor who played one of Beaver's pals, Whitey. And then finally, I'm excited to tell you all more about the actor who played Lumpy on the show, the amazing Frank Bank. And as I always do with these videos, I promise to throw in at least a couple of bonus surprises along the way that are guaranteed to take you down memory lane. So with all that said, let's get rolling. One of the things that you frequently hear about Leave It to Beaver is that the show presented a very idyllic version of what family life was like. Sometimes that comment is presented as criticism, and at other times it is in the context of praise. Regardless of whether you think the show was too pie in the sky, you can't deny its enduring appeal. Much like the Andy Griffith Show, which I'll mention again in a minute, this show serves as a refuge for those of us who are weary of a world full of chaos. And I think permeating throughout all of the idealism on the show was a strong feeling of kindness. Yep, the Beaver and every once in a while Wally, well, they'd get themselves into hot water, but at the end of the day, love would triumph, and along the way, a valuable lesson or two would be learned. And for almost 30 episodes on the show, this lady, the Beav's 5th grade teacher, Miss Landers, helped little Theodore make sense of the world. Played by actress Sue Randall, Alice Landers was exactly what every kid hoped for in a teacher. She was smart, pretty, and kind. Yep, a freaking hat trick in the world of education. Unlike this grump of a lady. See, I told you I'd return to the Andy Griffith Show again. I guess Miss Crump wasn't all that bad. And the more I think of it, she was pretty nice to Opie and Ernest T. Bass. But when you compare her to Miss Landers, well, she just pales in comparison. When I think back to my own elementary school teachers, I was never as lucky as the Beav and his classmates. But then again, I don't think many of us were. Prior to playing Miss Landers on Leave It to Beaver, Sue Randall had worked on a handful of TV shows, and she also appeared in the Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn feature film, Desk Set. But it was this role that made her a familiar face in most American homes during the late 50s and early 60s. And then again later on when the show became perhaps even more popular as kids watched reruns of the show during the 70s after school. Around the same time that she was on Leave It to Beaver, Sue also made an appearance on the original Twilight Zone TV series in an episode titled And When the Sky Was Opened. This is another episode of that show that was written by one of my favorite authors of all time, Richard Matheson. I've talked about him at length in other videos, so I won't do it here. But the man's breadth of work is amazing. I'm certain most of you have seen many TV shows and movies that Mr. Matheson had a hand in creating. Anyway, back to Sue Randall. When the Leave It to Beaver revival series debuted during the 80s, I must admit that I was surprised that Sue didn't make an appearance on that show. Back then, you couldn't just race to the internet to find out what happened. So it would be years before I was able to discover why Ms. Randall just kind of disappeared from TV. Now that I've been able to do a bit of researching, thank you internet, it seems like Sue retired from the world of entertainment after a car accident left her sidelined during the late 60s. I must admit, I don't know the whole story here, and I don't need to know it. But I do know that somewhere along the way, Ms. Randall fell in love, got married a couple of times, and had a couple of kids. I suspect that she may have decided that her family was her priority, and because of that, as much as any lingering injuries from an accident, she simply decided to stay away from the lights and cameras. I am also aware that by the mid-70s, Sue began to try to use her fame for the benefit of others. According to Wikipedia, she participated in various telethons and other charitable events to raise money to support programs and research battling arthritis, multiple sclerosis, blindness, and poor childhood education. In the early 80s, Sue was diagnosed with lung and larynx cancer, and despite a valiant battle, well, it was just too much for her. In 1984, at the all-too-young age of 49, Sue Randall, our kindly Miss Landers, succumbed to that dreaded disease. It would be easy to focus on the short time that she was here with us and grieve about that, but I propose instead we think about all that she was able to accomplish during her short lifetime. She was a star on a big hit TV show. She had a family who she loved very much, and they loved her back just as fiercely. And she gave of herself. She did what she could to step outside of her own little world and help others. Yep, that's what I think we should focus on. She was in real life, it turns out, every bit as wonderful as the character that she played on Leave It to Beaver.
Why doesn't the beaver ever learn his lesson? He is often taught his lesson. He promises to remember his lesson, but the next day he's forgotten his lesson. Is he deliberately ignoring his lesson? Not exactly. New evidence suggests that Beaver's lesson enters one ear, floats around his head for a few seconds, but avoids having any contact with his brain before exiting out the other side of his skull.
Oh, so that's it.
Learn your lesson. Watch Leave It to Beaver, weeknights in TV Land.
I hope this will be a good lesson to you.
Here's the thing about the actor who played Whitey on the classic TV show Leave It to Beaver. It would be super easy to focus on the negatives. The sad part of actor Stanley Fafara's life. But you know what? That isn't fair to Stanley. During his life there were highs and lows. Yep, there were some pretty low lows. But I guess you could say his life was full of extremes. So why not start with a pretty darn big high? That being, Stanley was cast as Beaver Cleaver's friend, Whitey at the age of 7, and for more than half a decade after that, Stanley was a big-time star. Sure, it was a supporting role, but the show was a huge hit, and because of that, so was Stanley. While on Leave It to Beaver, Stanley found time to act in a few other roles. But it was the role of Whitey that just kind of stuck with everyone. While it's probably not completely accurate to say he was typecast, it wouldn't be inaccurate either. When people saw Stanley, they immediately thought of Leave It to Beaver and Whitey. So when the show finally ended, as you might guess, acting gigs were a little more difficult to get. Plus, he'd arrived at the age where it was just more difficult to get roles in Hollywood. Why? Because TV show producers could cast a younger looking adult and not have to worry about the laws that were in place to protect minors. So what did Stanley do? Well, he went back to school and fell into something of a funk. I think it's kind of funny that if you research Stanley at all, whether it's Wikipedia, various websites, or even YouTube videos, it's quite likely that you'll read or hear mention of Paul Revere and the Raiders. Apparently, Stanley was a huge fan, and for at least a time, he hung out with the band. Truthfully, I don't know how much of that is true versus exaggeration, but it does make for a darn good story. What we do know is true is that Stanley's parents were worried about him and wanted him as far away from the blossoming drug-induced hippie culture that was so prevalent in the 60s. So they did what any good parent would do. They shipped their boy off to Jamaica. I know, that isn't what I would do either. But apparently Stanley had a sister there, and for whatever reason the folks thought that this would be a good idea. While in Jamaica, Stanley tried his hand at being an artist, a painter, but it didn't stick. However, drugs and alcohol, well, they did stick, and shipping Stanley off to another country really didn't solve that problem. So I've already mentioned that Stanley's life is full of extremes, and I guess this is the extremely low part of his story. He came home to the U.S., he got married, and he got even more heavily involved in all sorts of vice. Of course, this affected his relationships, his ability to maintain them, and before you knew it, Stanley had hit rock bottom, committing petty theft to maintain a heroin habit. Truly a sad story, at least at this point. Especially when you think about the Leave It to Beaver renaissance that was going on due to cable TV's never-ending appetite for programming. When Leave It to Beaver reruns proved popular with a new generation of viewers, Hollywood came a-calling, and most of the cast came back, first in a TV movie and then in a brand new TV series that ran on the Disney Channel and then on Superstation TBS for more than 5 years. Because of Stanley's life choices, he wasn't part of this amazing comeback story. As you might expect, that was incredibly difficult for him. And the real rock bottom was a heroin addiction that led to him contracting hepatitis, as well as a brief period of incarceration. When Stanley was finally released from prison, he resolved to kick his habit once and for all. Stanley realized that this was likely his last chance, and he framed that phrase and hung it on the wall of his modest room in a halfway house. From there, he did what he had never been able to do before. He put his past behind him. All of it, and he began truly engaging in the court-ordered counseling sessions, both his own, as well as learning from others around him. It wasn't easy, but as time progressed, it became more and more clear that Stanley was becoming a different person. He wasn't Whitey, and he wasn't that drug-addled person who had hit rock bottom just a few years earlier. No, instead he was Stanley Fafara, and he began living his new life, which included a career as a graphic designer, as well as volunteer work helping others conquer the same demons that he had vanquished. You know, Stanley Fafara was clean and sober from 1995 on, and yet when people talk about him, they rarely mention that large chunk of time at the end of his life where he was once again on top of things. No, he wasn't wealthy. In fact, one might say he was pretty darn poor, but still, Stanley had his life back, and that is a victory well worth celebrating. Sadly, in 2003, Stanley passed away due to complications brought on from hepatitis. It would be years before a headstone would be added to his grave because Stanley didn't have any real assets to his name that could be sold to pay for such a thing. It was only through the generosity and kindness of others that ultimately Stanley had a marker that would celebrate his life. A life full of extremes. There were highs and there were lows. But you know what? Stanley clawed his way out of that pit of despair and ultimately ended up victorious. We should remember him for that, maybe even more than for the smiles that he brings routinely to fans watching his classic television program, Leave It to Beaver.
And now, this message.
If you're poor and Kellogg's cornflakes, you've earned a special place on the front of America's favorite cereal. Sit down to a familiar face. The face of a Kellogg cornflake lover, the face of America too. When you sit down to America's favorite cereal, the face on the package is you. So sit down to a familiar face.
Years ago, when I started watching Leave It to Beaver for the first time, whenever Wally's friend Lumpy would show up, I knew the Cleaver boys were headed for trouble. Lumpy, often aided by that scallywag of scallywags, Eddie Haskell, was always up for a little bit of mischief. In fact, both of those boys were just wired that way. In fact, Clarence Lumpy Rutherford, as played by actor Frank Bank, had been that way from the very beginning. During his memorable first appearance, he was actually more of a bully than he would turn out to be. In that first episode, for whatever reasons, Lumpy felt like Wally and the Beav needed to walk the long way home. Of course, the boys got their revenge. Well, kinda. It turns out that the trap that they'd set for Lumpy would be stumbled into instead by his father. As time went on, Lumpy became a friend to Wally. As he was prone to pranks and all sorts of mischief, he wasn't always the best of friends, but he was a friend nonetheless. During the show's 6 seasons, Bank would appear as Lumpy more than 50 times. And as the show progressed, Lumpy's character continued to develop and we got to learn more about him, such as the fact that he was a little on the slow side, some might even say dim-witted. Although he was in the same grade as Wally, he was actually 3 years older than him. We also began to understand why Lumpy was a bit of a bully, as he turned out to be teased quite a bit because of his size. Anyway, by the time season 6 came to an end, I must admit that I had grown awful fond of Lumpy. As with many of the characters on the show, including Eddie Haskell, the writers and other members of the creative team were not content to simply let Lumpy be two-dimensional. Sure, he was an occasional foil and sometimes antagonist for a character on the show, but he was also someone who, although he had many faults, you could really get behind and care for. At least I did. And you know what? The same holds true for the actor, Frank Bank. It turns out that Frank had been playing against type all along. Frank wasn't dim-witted at all. In fact, He was quite a savvy guy, especially with money, and Frank knew that he needed to figure out what life after Leave It to Beaver looked like. On more than one occasion, Frank has admitted that he would have enjoyed working longer in the entertainment industry. Unfortunately, post-Beaver, casting directors could only see Lumpy whenever Frank auditioned for something. It turns out, like many of his castmates, Frank had been typecast. And Frank knew that he didn't want to end up like George Reeves. Whether it was murder or suicide, what is certain is that Reeves was down on his luck after The Adventures of Superman came to an end because of typecasting. And Frank knew that he didn't want to take even one step down that path. So how could he survive, perhaps even thrive? How could he strike back against an industry that refused to acknowledge that he was anything more than Clarence Lumpy Rutherford? The answer, it turns out, was pretty darn simple. He would put his keen mind and his financial savviness to work. Within just a few years after Leave It to Beaver ended, Bank had become a licensed broker handling complicated stock and bond transactions for some of the biggest companies in the U.S. Over time, he would build a reputation as an insightful financial advisor who understood market dynamics and could apply the right amount of risk to garner an appropriate return for his clients. Before long, Bank was making more money than he ever thought possible, even more than he might have had if he'd continued to work full-time in the entertainment industry. And of course, Bank did love being Lumpy. So he returned for the Still the Beaver TV movie and the new Leave It to Beaver TV show, and it was fun to see him back in action as Lumpy once again. You know, one of these days I would love to see that show return to television. I understand there's some legal hurdles that need to be overcome, but it sure would be nice to see the updated adventures of Wally and the Beaver again. It really would. Come on, me TV. Make it happen. I know you can. I have faith. I believe in you guys. But getting back to Frank. Over time, Frank's friends and castmates all began to rely on his financial wisdom to ensure that they were in a good place financially for the remainder of their lives. And the best part was that they knew what kind of guy their financial advisor was. He was smart, and most importantly, he was someone that they could trust. Heck, they'd known him since he was just a kid. You know what? Frank took their trust very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that he was often more than just a financial advisor. You see, Frank became a trusted advisor for a lot of different things. He found many ways to strike back at the industry that had, at least for a time, felt that he was no longer relevant, especially whenever there was some sort of renegotiation of contracts due to advents in new technology such as streaming media. Frank was right there, helping his former castmates, better said friends, understand what really was in their best interest. Also, after actress Barbara Billingsley passed away, Frank was instrumental in ensuring that she received long overdue recognition for her good deeds both on screen and off. Examples of all of these things can be found on YouTube, of all things, and if you track them down, you'll find at the center of it all a man who was passionate about helping his friends. Frank isn't with us anymore. I guess you could say his days of striking back are over. Cancer finally got this fighter. He's been gone for a few years now, April 2013 to be exact, dead at the age of 71. Still young, gosh dang it. Anyway, if you want to learn more about this life well lived, you may want to pick up his autobiography, Call Me Lumpy. From what I understand, this book is something of a wild ride. Alright, one last picture. Let's go with the Three Musketeers. The terrific trio. Okay, maybe a better way to describe them is the Trinity of Terror. So what did you think about Lumpy? Did you enjoy the character, or was he more of an irritation than anything else for you? Please share your memories in the comments section, and while you're at it, I would appreciate a thumbs up, maybe even share this video on Facebook or Twitter, and what the heck, why not subscribe to the channel? I talk about music, movies, and television, mostly from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. You know, the good stuff. But most importantly, and as always, thank you so much for watching.
Thank you all for standing by through and through. It's the kind of strength that lifts the shadows too.
Click on that thumbnail 'cause it's time to go. Dave's got the classics, let the memories flow. TV shows and movies that we all hold so dear. On his YouTube channel, he's keeping memories near. Dave Sundstrom, bringing back the good stuff, oh yeah.